Okay, so this is on reporting cash. Most large companies are going to use the term cash and cash equivalents. And so it follows that you need to know the distinction between what's cash and what's a cash equivalent. So your cash equivalent, it, says in the notes there, they're short-term, highly liquid investments. They have to be readily convertible to known amounts of cash, and they have to be so near their maturity that the change in interest rates would not be a factor. So what they have to be is nearly cash. They have to be pretty equivalent to cash in terms of liquidity. So that's a cash equivalent. So if you look at specific things that can be cash equivalents, and it depends on the terms that are stated on them. So some treasury bills, some commercial paper, some money market funds that have checking can be cash equivalents if they meet those criteria above. Not cash equivalents would be any of those same things, but if there were penalties for early withdrawal, if there happened to be no checking on them, if they weren't available. So anyway, you have to take a look at, be able to distinguish cash equivalents. The other thing in cash, FASB wanted to eliminate that classification, and there's a little article, a little box that talks a little bit about the rationale for that. Restricted cash, that should be reported separately under current or long term, depending on when it's going to be used. If we go back to the very beginning of, what I said at the beginning of this chapter, what we are trying to report is the underlying economic reality. And if you have cash that's restricted, it's not available to pay your current obligations because it's going to be used for something else. So that has to be specified on your financial statements. So you can have cash restricted because you're going to be building a new plant or facility, maybe paying off a bond issue, all kinds of things like that. You can also have separate restricted cash in the form of a separate cash account for payroll, for dividends, or even your petty cash fund. That's cash that is set aside for a specific purpose, and usually it's not material, so it's not separated from your regular cash. When it is material, you do have to report it separately. So that would be where your bond funds might come in, but petty cash, even though it is set aside for a specific purpose, that's usually just included with your cash. Okay, so compensating balances, you also have to be aware of what those are. When you take out a loan from a bank or other financial institution, sometimes as part of that loan agreement, they require that you keep a minimum balance of a certain amount in your checking account at all times. If your balance falls below that amount, then you're in default on the loan and they can call the whole thing in. So my construction company, I got a bank to lend me $1 million. Imagine that. They loaned me $1 million. And as part of that, we had to keep $50,000 in our checking account at that bank at all times. That was part of the loan agreement. If it fell below that, well, they could call in that entire loan, which would have been ugly. So you have to know what a compensating balance is, and also, basically, generally you're going to be disclosing those in the notes to the financial statements. Okay, bank overdrafts are handled differently depending on the number of bank accounts you have at a bank. This is where you've bounced checks and your account has a negative balance. If you only have one account at that bank and you've got a negative balance in it, you do not report that as negative cash, you report that as a current liability. If you have two accounts at the same bank, and say one was overdrawn by $10 and the other had 100 in it, you could net those out and report cash of 90. But that's only if you have two accounts at the same bank, and if you add them together, the balance is not negative. Okay? All right, so questions you should be able to answer once you're done with this section. You need to know the difference between what's cash, what's a cash equivalent, and what is a short-term investment or a temporary investment. Also, what's a compensating balance, how it's reported, and then what do we do? How do we report restricted cash? Okay, so our next adventure will be into cash controls.